Everything, everything gonna be all right this morning.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Off to the races for another episode for the archives. It's me speaking to you on this year of our Lord, 5/13/2024. Man, I'm so stoked to do what I do because sometimes you just wind up meeting and talking to just some really cool people, dude. You really cool people, and then you wind up sometimes even staying in touch with them. And this cat here, if you guys have followed the show, been about, I don't even know, 6 months maybe, I interviewed a cat by the name of Don Sikorsky. He was executive producer of a movie called City of Lies, which chronicled the murder and the cover-up of the murder of Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Biggie Smalls. And my point of contact at the time was my guest today, and I've just have been so fortunate to be able to get to know him a little bit better, talk to him about what they're up to over at Criminal Minded Media, and he's taking a little bit of time out today. We've been trying to put this together for a while, but we're going to talk about why it's easier now because they're on hiatus with one show while they're doing another show. We're going to talk about everything they got going on over at Criminal Minded Media. He is the Greek, ladies and gentlemen. John Anagnapoulos is joining us today. What's up, brother?
I am doing well, my friend. How about yourself? Happy to be here.
Yeah, no complaints, man. No complaints. It's like I say, man, you and I, we talk all the time, whether or not talking, we're in text. And since getting to know you guys and getting to interview Don and getting into what you guys are doing over the Criminal Minded Media, specifically the dossier, I've had so many questions. You and I have been back and forth, and you know, you're kind of like me in that you're a really big savant and really into like the research side of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, when you go check out the presentations over at Criminal Minded Media, not only are these, if you're into true crime, this is really what they get into. Very, very well-produced series. And like I said, being the geek I am on research, just amazing, in-depth research on each of these subjects. And we're going to touch on a little bit of all of it. But again, thank you so much for your time, brother. I don't know where you find the hours in the day. I sometimes wonder myself. But I love a good origin story, brother. Where'd you come from?
Okay.
I know you're down there in Arizona. And what got you into what you're into, man? When did the bug bite you?
So that's a great question. And I came into this really the most random act of God way. I ended up in this business working with Don up until, so I always joke, my previous life, I spent many years owning a restaurant and nightclub with my dad. And we closed in the mid-2000 teens, we'll call it. At that point, I jumped over with a good friend of mine by the name of Rick Phillips, and we were doing festivals around the country, taco festivals. And so we are plugging away. We had just had this amazing taco festival in Austin, Texas. And 3 weeks later, in March of 2020, we all know what occurred, and festivals basically ceased to exist in the middle of March of 2020 when COVID hit. So I am sitting around with my buddy Rick, who owned the taco festival, and a longtime friend of ours by the name of Don Sikorsky reached out to us, said, I know you knuckleheads have been sitting around for a couple months wondering what the heck you're going to do with yourselves professionally. And he started to give us a little bit of background about the work he had been doing for, at that point, a few years. You know, he had been hired to produce a documentary for Fox Entertainment called Who Shot Biggie and Tupac. Followed up right after that, or really around the same time, he and his friend Brad Furman started making City of Lies with Johnny Depp. And both of these projects obviously revolve around the murder of Biggie, the cover-up by the LAPD of what transpired. So Don called us excitedly and said, hey, I got the lead FBI agent who investigated Biggie's murder. He's ready to go on the record. I want to tell this in a podcast forum where I don't have any studio executives telling me what I'm allowed to put on the air, what I'm not allowed to put on the air. And are you guys interested in coming aboard? And so I started off as a research editor for Don on season 1 of the dossier. And it's kind of funny. The first little bit of homework he gave me was to dig into the Frank Liga, Kevin Gaines shootout in LA, 2 LAPD officers going Wild West in an intersection in midday traffic.
Literally.
Yeah. And so it was really kind of a pretty cool full circle moment when Frank Liga reached out to us just as we were getting ready to release season 2 of the dossier, saying he would be interested in talking to us after listening to season 1. So that's kind of how I started. Criminal Minded Media was pretty much built off season 1 of the dossier. And that set off, we really like doing investigative, deeply detailed and researched podcast series. That cross section of hip hop and true crime was really something that fascinated us. Obviously, we've branched out since then into a number of other different investigations and stories, but that's really my origin story. So I started off as a research editor, and here I am 4 years later. Now I'm the managing editor over here at CMM. And, depending on Don's busy schedule, I can, my role with different projects will fluctuate. I co-wrote the Syndicate, the Don Bowles podcast that we did that I'm sure we'll get into later.
Yes.
And now myself and Nicole Luciano, who's another producer on the dossier, have been given our own show called Collateral Damage, because Nikki and I are just like you. We are up late at night digging into stuff all the time. And at some point, Don and Rick, the co-founder of Criminal Minded Media, said, sitting here listening to you guys on the phone for an hour every day, you really need to start recording this and making a show out of it. So that's how Collateral Damage came to be. And
we're going to get into that one and what that one's all about. But in particular, I know why kind of I do it, but why true crimes for you? I know it's a huge genre now, and it's just absolutely through the roof for you guys, and for you in particular. Why true crimes? What about true crimes fascinates you?
It really it's with Don. I've been friends with Don for, not to age us, but over 25 years now. And Don, since he graduated from NYU journalism school, has just been fascinated by, it really isn't, it's funny. It technically is true crime, but he's always been fascinated by the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
As you can tell by a lot of our projects, a lot of the work we do focuses on people who we believe have been done wrong, or investigations that have been done improperly, controversially. And so it's really always been about that. Don spent some time right out of NYU working as a clerk for the Eastern and Southern District in New York. So he had a front row seat to a lot of this stuff, the failed war on drugs, mass incarceration, all that stuff just really drives him. And, his motivations and his interests quickly grew into us. And quite honestly, when you start looking at some of these cases, especially the Biggie case being my first job with Criminal Minded Media, it gets his hooks into you once you see kind of the corruption and everything that happened, and it becomes a driving force in your work.
And I find it very interesting. And again, we're going to get into it a little bit more in depth, but whether it's specifically, like for me, it started with like JFK, and that's what started me down the rabbit hole of a lot of whodunits and conspiracy world, et cetera. But the parallels between like a JFK assassination or an RFK assassination, Martin Luther King, any of these, Biggie, Don Bowles, there's so many parallels in that people say like, oh, how could these big vast conspiracies take place and somebody not say something? Oftentimes people do say something, but as long as you have people to create the conspiracy and maintain that false narrative through certain like official channels, law enforcement, et cetera, and then you get the media involved, that's all you really need. That's all you really need is a couple key people in these key places to maintain a false narrative, and you're locked and loaded. Whether, like, again, any of these things I mentioned, that's usually the common denominator. You have a lot of people in charge to create this false narrative, and then you have certain elements of media to maintain it.
That is 100% the playbook of a cover-up right there.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Having someone in power that chooses to take the wrong path and cover something up. You recruit, again, and we don't have to I don't mean to keep hammering the Biggie case, but, you recruit someone like Chuck Phillips at the time, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and use a newspaper like the LA Times, which was the newspaper of record in Los Angeles. So basically they are the law in Los Angeles, and it doesn't matter what the LA Weeklies and LA Daily News have to say. If the LA Times is printing false narratives, 85 to 90% of the public are going to buy it because they read it in the LA Times. So the media is an incredibly powerful tool when talking about cover-ups and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. So where do we start here, man? Chronologically, I mean, I guess we could kind of, a lot of the things you guys are into, and some of this we're going to touch on a little bit more in depth than others because there's so many, again, like the JFK or any of these cases that you guys have gotten into, there's so many layers. There's so many names.
Yes.
There's so many players involved. It's literally almost, for us to do it right now, it's almost like starting watching Game of Thrones in like season 5 and like, who the fuck, who what? I mean, you just don't know. There's so much going on. So I, again, highly suggest, man, if anybody's into true crime or just whatever, just really good podcast content, go over there and check them out at Criminal Minded Media. But, you know, from a chronological standpoint, if people are into like East Coast hip hop, which I always was, you often heard about the name Jimmy Henchman. And you guys have a big series on Jimmy Henchman. If you can, chronicle a little bit who this guy was and how crucial he was to that kind of East Coast hip hop world. You heard his name. You just have heard his name a lot on the East Coast. Tell us who he is and his role in a lot of things that relates to hip hop on the East Coast and just in general.
Sure. So Jimmy Rosemond, his moniker was Jimmy Henchman, was a kid that grew up on the streets of Brooklyn. And he came from, his family immigrated over here, I want to say from Haiti. His dad immigrated over. He was, there was some political persecution. So the family moves over here when Jimmy's a very, very young child, grows up in the rough and tumble streets back then. This is the mid 70s when street gangs in New York are really, really growing in power. And he was a hustler. He was doing all the wrong things. By the time he was 17, 18 years old, he was in prison for attempted murder, I believe. And while in prison at a young age, he happens to end up next to, I believe it was Mutulu Shakur, who starts teaching him about, you know, Islam and things of that nature. And it just really kind of spurred him to want to do something different. When he gets out of prison, of course, immediately he jumps right back in the game because the crack era had hit full force in New York City. But he actually gets into the music business accidentally. He was approached by, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank, the co-founder of the How Can I Be Down hip hop conference that I believe still takes place in Miami every year for a lot of the movers and shakers inside hip hop. So Jimmy got bit with the music bug by helping throw that party. And before you know it, it's kind of funny, but he basically opened up an office in Manhattan to escape law enforcement who was looking for him back home in Brooklyn and in Queens. And he creates, at the time it was called Henchman Entertainment. And he starts getting together a stable of producers and trying to sign talent. And he signs a group by the name of Groove Theory. And immediately Groove Theory hits. They have a top 5 hit. Follows that up with producing an album for Salt and Pepper. And within like 6 months of Jimmy getting into the music industry, he's got 2 top 10 hits. And his reputation grew as he tried to kind of leave the streets behind. He eventually ends up one of the biggest managers in hip hop. He had everybody from The Game, Rick Ross, gosh, what's his name? Gucci Mane. And then he started spreading out into other aspects of entertainment. He signed Michael K. Williams, the actor who famously played Omar on The Wire. For a while, he represented Mike Tyson. He's actually one of the people who helped negotiate Mike's last big payday, the fight with Lennox Lewis. So Jimmy, he was producing movies. Yeah, he had spread his wings into all aspects of entertainment, but there was always these murmurs. He was kind of like on the East Coast. The way people talked about Jimmy out there was like how they talked about Suge Knight out west, which is funny because Jimmy's like 5'9", 160 pounds. But, you know, he had that very scary reputation from his time as a kid on the streets in New York. And no matter how hard he tried to kind of escape his past, he eventually ends up convicted of CCE charges, which is the kingpin charge. And Jimmy currently has a longer prison sentence than El Chapo, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. Was Jimmy an angel? No. But does Jimmy deserve to be sitting in prison for the rest of his life? Absolutely not. And so Don was put in contact with Jimmy, and I want to say about 2015, 2016, and they started having phone conversations, and it eventually turned into us really taking a deep look into his case. And we got a hold of everything, all the court transcripts, all the evidence that the government used to convict him, which was basically they just got about 5 or 6 guys, said you're going to prison for the rest of your life unless you put Jimmy Rosemond in the box and he is the head on our wall. And that's pretty much what happened. He sits in prison today. And the sad part is he was actually about to be pardoned by former President Trump. He was on the pardon list. We were even contacted by the lawyers involved in the case who were handling his pardon. And Don had to write a letter to then President Trump telling him why we thought Jimmy should receive a pardon. And in typical, not to get political, but in the craziness of January 6th, Trump decided or just forgot to send the paperwork through for the pardon. Trump had personally told Jimmy's family on a phone call to head to, he was at the time in prison, and he told the Rosemond family to go there, wait for him. He's going to have him out before Christmas. And Christmas came and went. The end of Trump's presidency came and went, and no pardon ever took place. So that is making its way currently through the federal court system. And it's a really interesting theory because there are a number of people, not just the Rosemond family, but the late Jim Brown, the famous athlete, and not just athlete. That really is not a proper description of Jim Brown, but President Trump told Jim Brown and his wife the same thing. He had pardoned him and he was going to get him out of prison. So that's making its way through the courts right now. Is a president saying you're pardoned good enough to get you out of prison? But I'll tell you the truth, Jimmy, he obviously there's a lot of accusations. One being Tupac accused him of being the guy that set him up in the whole Quad Studios incident. There's a really ugly beef that took place between the Game and 50 Cent that eventually ensnared Jimmy, and Jimmy's 13-year-old son was assaulted by members of the G Unit while 50 Cent sat by and watched. And it got really nasty. And so, Jimmy is always somehow, no matter how hard he tries to get out of the streets, seems to always get like that famous Godfather.
Every time I try to get out.
Yep. Yeah. And I'll tell you the truth. I went in thinking one thing about Jimmy, and, just because his reputation preceded him. And as we continued our work, I've really, really grown to like Jimmy. He is incredibly intelligent, about as charismatic a guy as you will ever come across. And really, I feel we all feel he was done pretty dirty by a U.S. attorney who was using this case to springboard himself. Interesting little fact, that U.S. attorney's name is Todd Kaminsky. And after he tried Jimmy Henchman and got his conviction, he never tried another case. He then immediately ran for what was it? City councilman, and he is currently United States Senator Todd Kaminsky. Wow. And in his most recent campaign commercials, the first thing he mentions is putting away Jimmy Henchman. So he rode Jimmy all the way to a U.S. Senate.
And that's not uncommon. People building, especially prosecutors, building their careers off of shit like that. God, that's so bogus. Yep. If you want to check it out more in depth, again, this is just one of the mini series they have. This is called Unjust Justice over there at Criminal Minded Media. And it's interesting to kind of get into Don's origin story a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. Check out his series. What was it called? Hip Hop Police. What was that called specifically, John?
So his first project, once he got graduated from NYU, was the documentary film Rap Sheet, Hip Hop and the Cops. And we recently released a podcast based off of his journey as this fresh-faced journalism school graduate who all of a sudden ends up in the world of hip hop after convincing, I believe it was a Miami Police Department officer,
send him the file,
gave him that 500-page dossier, which the hip hop cops are a thing. It's their technical name is the Rap Intelligence Unit in New York, and now there are Rap Intelligence units in Miami, and I'm sure other places in the country. But at the time, coming off of a lot of the violence in the late 90s surrounding hip hop, the NYPD, the DEA, HIDA, which is the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Unit, they all banded together and really just started violating all forms of civil rights of hip hop stars, managers, etc. If you step foot in New York City and you were a hip hop star, you were being surveilled 24/7.
Yes.
And it really is, because these guys come from certain backgrounds, all of a sudden they're being surveilled by law enforcement 24/7, even if they do not have a misdemeanor on their record. If they're
full-on
rappers,
violation
they're
of
being
the Fourth Amendment. Yeah, that's what I found so fascinating. When I talked to Don, I'm like, these guys were like joyous and lamenting the fact that they're surveilling these people when they hadn't even done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It was like they were, like you said, full-on violation. So there is this huge precedent that goes back a while between, law enforcement and, surveilling and looking out for potential threats in the hip hop community. If you watch that documentary, which Don does, it's awesome because he gets, like you guys all do, and all these different aspects of your presentations, really heavy, unfettered access to. I mean, shit, he was interviewing like Busta Rhymes. I mean, he was really in depth with his with the people he was able to get and talk about this kind of stuff, because a lot of them cats were hip to it, but they just didn't know it was like officially existed. So I think Don kind of solidified what they already suspected to some degree.
Absolutely, and it's funny. It just shows you how young he was. And, when we're young, we are much braver than brighter. And for him to show up, I believe it was actually, speaking of the How Can I Be Damned music conference, I think that's where Don went once he got a hold of this dossier. And imagine this 23, 24-year-old white kid rolling up to these hip hop stars with these 500-page law enforcement dossiers. I mean, I would imagine just about everybody thought he was a cop. And so he was lucky enough to meet Steve LaBelle, who's very influential in the music industry, the hip hop industry. And Steve started taking him around and introducing him to a lot of these people. They actually, funny enough, Don spent, I believe it was 3 days out at Death Row Records hanging around with Suge Knight, trying to get him to go on the record about this stuff. And that's really how he got his foot in the door with regards to the hip hop community. And obviously that has greatly influenced a lot of the work he's done since, all the way through the stuff that we've done.
Well, and we're going to get into that one, but that's potentially so hugely game-changing, the work you guys are doing as it relates to the dossier and the potential outcome that could, not necessarily, who knows, but it could reopen the case some 30 years later, and we're going to get into that down the line. But Unjust Justice, check it out. It's the James Roseman story. Definitely worth your time, and as well as the documentary. Say it again. I don't want to say I was going to say Rap Sheet.
Rap Sheet. It's called Rap Sheet, Hip Hop, and the Cops, and it's really excellent work for a kid just straight out of film school who went and bought a camera and decided to make a movie. Yeah,
definitely. It's definitely worth your time. And to people a little older like me who, not the origins of hip hop, but kind of like that early 90s of, somewhat the golden age of hip hop. But it's definitely interesting to see what kind of infiltration was going on back then. And Mr. Sikorsky, he chronicles it amazingly, like you guys always do. But moving on, man, to the next one that I kind of did a small dive when I first got to know you, but did not do the deep dive on this one until very recently. And I'm like, oh my God, Jeff, you were sleeping on this one. This is called The Syndicate, man. This is the death and the killing, the murder of an investigative journalist in the 70s by the name of Don Bowles. He was basically talking the right shit to the wrong people and caught some serious smoke. And it's just absolutely amazing. Again, the layers in this one. And again, the same story, man. A false narrative was created. It was maintained by the certain media outlets. People freaking died trying to get to the bottom of it. Talk to me about The Syndicate and the life and tale of Don Bowles.
So it's interesting, being born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, I grew up strangely connected to this case without any clue that I was connected to this case. Don Bowles, a little background. Don Bowles was this incredible investigative reporter out here. He worked for the Arizona Republic. He had been twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He had uncovered massive mafia infiltration into the state of Arizona. It began in the late 50s, but by the 60s, you have Joseph Bonanno, who's probably the most powerful man in La Cosa Nostra, quote unquote, retiring to Tucson, Arizona, where
one of the five families, right? The Bonannos. That was one of the five. Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently, there's the Banana Wars, or what they were called in New York in the early '60s, and Joe Bonanno, I believe, tried to have one or two of the other people sitting on the commission murdered, and so while everybody's looking for him to respond in kind, he vanishes and then just reappears in Tucson, Arizona. So the Bonanno family infiltrates Arizona beginning in the mid-'60s, and Bonanno then invites the Chicago outfit to join them out there and kind of handle Phoenix. So by the early 70s, the mob had their fingers in everything out here in Arizona. There was something called the blind trust. It's basically like you hear about people investing or hiding their money in Switzerland or places like that.
Yeah.
The blind trust system you could take all your ill-gotten gains from, the skim at the dog tracks to drug dealing to whatever your criminal enterprise was, and invest it legally in real estate, in any aspect of business in Arizona. And you could do it anonymously. The only thing, you would do it by basically a random number. So the Bonanno crime family could buy a bank, and all you know about it is this random number of the blind trust number. And so a lot of organized criminals and crime developed in Arizona at the time, and Don Bolles was on top of all of this. He was about to break a pretty big story from what we have been able to discover. And 2 days after, he tells a close friend by the name of Kathy Colby, I've got this massive story. It involves the mafia, politicians, the dog tracks. There was a gold theft ring where gold was going out the back door of Motorola to the tune of about $2 million a month. And this is 1970, so just imagine how much money that would be nowadays. And on June 2nd of 1976, he gets a message at the Arizona Republic, and it's from a guy named John Adamson. He says, meet me at the Clarendon Hotel at 11:30. I have information on Barry Goldwater, who was a senator out here, another corrupt, quote-unquote, corrupt politician. So Bolles goes over, writes a note, leaves it on his desk, going to meet Adamson, 11:30, Clarendon Hotel. He shows up, waits a few minutes. John Adamson calls the hotel lobby, because back in those days, there were no such things as text messages and cell phones. Adamson calls and says, I can't make it. We're going to have to reschedule. Bolles says, okay, walks outside, gets in his Datsun, starts the car, and as he hits reverse on the car, a bomb goes off. And it was kind of a mangled hit. The bomb didn't kill him immediately. He ended up suffering for 12 days as they amputated an arm, a leg, another leg, and eventually dies from poisoning from the shrapnel getting into his blood system. But he truly suffered. But as he's laying on the pavement waiting for help, he tells a woman and a man who had rushed to help him, they finally got me. The mafia, Emprise, find John Adamson. So the last words he spoke, you would think, would be where Phoenix PD and all the other investigatory whether it's the FBI, I believe they were involved at the beginning, but he basically gave investigators a roadmap of who did this to him. And of course, Phoenix PD almost immediately just ignores that roadmap outside of John Adamson and comes up with a whole new theory about why Don Bolles was killed that unfortunately is the prevalent theory today. It's, even though it's not correct.
Well, I wouldn't say Adamson was necessarily a patsy, but he was kind of this low-level cat that really took the heat for everything. And you had mentioned Don had left 2 notes on his desk. The first one, like you said, meeting John Adamson, 11:15 at the Clarendon House, 4th and Clarendon. And the second one was to his supervisor, Bernie Wynn, and said, Bernie, I've gone to meet that guy with the info on Steiger at the Clarendon House, and he's going to be back. I'm doing all this, but I'll be back at such and such. Who was Steiger?
So Sam Steiger was actually he was a congressman, and he and Bolles were allies. So, and again, this is as complex and layered a story, so I'll try to make it as easily digestible for your listeners. But as Bolles was investigating a lot of these criminal ties with the mob, and one of his main focuses was this company Emprise. Emprise was a massive, they still are, they've actually rebranded themselves as Delaware North, and they do in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 billion of revenue every year. But at the time, Emprise was a concessionaire conglomerate. So like the 1960 Olympics in Rome was, that was Emprise. They had started at this point in the 70s buying professional sports franchises like the Kansas City Royals, who eventually became the Sacramento Kings basketball team. And they had partnered in all of the horse and dog racing tracks in Arizona at this time. So they had monopolized the horse and dog racing tracks with a local family by the name of the Funks. And
which, I'm sorry, if you're going to do some criminal stuff, that's a great thing to get into because it's an all-cash business.
Yes, 100%. You just nailed it. That's why it made it so easy for the mob to get their skim, because it's all cash. And so Bolles was investigating the Funks, and the Funk family, specifically a guy by the name of Bradley Funk, found out about this, and he hired someone to tap Don Bolles' phones, to do all sorts of illegal stuff to both Bolles and Sam Steiger. And the only reason we found out about this because Bradley Funk reneged on paying the guy who he had hired to tap the phones of Bolles and a congressman. So this gentleman, his name was George Johnson. He just passed away about a week ago, actually.
Really?
Yeah, he contacted Congressman Steiger, and in a scene like straight out of All the President's Men, there's this midnight meeting with Steiger, Bolles, and George Johnson in some out-of-the-way hotel, and he informs them what's going on, and he gives them information that basically makes it impossible for him to not be telling the truth. He's telling them about phone calls he heard and things like that, and this is stuff that no one knew about. So Bolles contacts the FBI. It gets really messy. There are lawsuits and countersuits. Bolles, George Johnson, and Sam Steiger are actually called out to Washington, D.C., where they testify before Congress. They were looking into organized crime, infiltrating professional sports.
I'm sorry, Bolles testified in front of Congress?
Bolles and George Johnson and Sam Steiger were all called in front of Congress to testify about all this stuff. And so this is kind of the environment that Bolles was in at the time. And to this day, it's still very peculiar, and we're digging to try to find out the real answer. But in 1973 or 74, there was a hush-hush settlement between the Funks and the Arizona Republic on this lawsuit. And Don Bolles is basically told to he's forced to take a vacation. When he gets back, he finds out he's no longer on the investigative journalism beat. And they kind of just, toss him off to cover the state legislature. And Bolles was extraordinarily unhappy about this. And at the time of his death was actually in the process of interviewing with other newspaper companies to go to work for them and become the investigative journalist that he'd always been. He was a stringer for like Newsweek magazine, Time magazine, but this was kind of the environment that Bolles was mixed up in, and that is what we believe ended up causing his death, not this bogus theory about a local businessman being upset about Bolles writing a critical article in the newspaper and deciding 4 months later to murder him for an article written in February.
And is that Max Dunlap?
Yeah, so Max Dunlap.
I just want hold up. Explain that here in a second. But because you had mentioned, is there any validity that Don was smashing on one of this Funk guy's wife?
Well, it's something we tried to handle as delicately as possible, because Don Bolles is a truly heroic figure when it comes to what he did as a journalist. But there were whispers, more than whispers, that Bolles, Bradley Funk was in the middle of a really ugly, contentious divorce, and his soon-to-be ex-wife had made some really nasty accusations about child molestation. It was really nasty. And wow. Bolles had become, I don't think captivated is the right word, but he had become a really big cheerleader for Betty Funk Richardson, and he offered to help her in any way possible in this divorce because of the accusations about Bradley Funk molesting his kids. And over the course of them getting to know each other, Betty Funk Richardson became one of Don Bolles' main sources on the illegal activity going on around the dog tracks and things of that nature. There were always whispers that this relationship crossed over from source/confidant into something a little more not nefarious, but yeah, there were whispers that there was an affair going on between Bolles and Betty Funk Richardson. And, like I said, we tried to handle that as delicately as possible, because we didn't want that to become the story. Because unfortunately, in the 70s, journalists were almost like athletes are today. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were these conquering heroes.
Yes.
And Don Bolles probably wouldn't have been the first journalist to do a couple things on the side that he probably shouldn't have done. But I will say, in our opinion, that is one of the big reasons that Don Bolles was murdered, because of the hatred that Bradley Funk had personally for Don Bolles with regards to whatever his relationship was with Betty Funk Richardson. Yeah. It infuriated Bradley Funk.
Well, and there were kind of people were kind of alluding to the fact that's why, and I don't know if this is true or not, the bomb was placed where it was, directly under Don, technically his ball, you know what I mean, his undercarriage there, to hit him the way they hit him, because not only was he writing bad stories, but he was also, you know, engaging in coitus with one of the Funks' wife, which is frowned upon.
Yes, you know, and that's a journalist by the name of Don Devereaux said that so eloquently on our podcast. Devereaux is someone I'd love to get into later, but he, you know, you're talking about a bomb under a guy's crotch at high noon in the middle of, I mean, the Clarendon Hotel was a pretty high profile place at the time. This was a castration killing, you know, this was trying to take his manhood as well as his life. And that always, you know, like Devereaux said, he immediately should have been looking for an angry husband or an angry ex-husband. And, you know, there was a source that told Devereaux this murder started off as a personal vendetta that grew to involve much more professional interests along the way. You know, apparently Devereaux is someone who cultivated massive amounts of mafia sources out here, to the extent that when there was a mafia roundup in the mid-'80s, the Arizona Republic listed this journalist, Devereaux, as an unindicted co-conspirator in the mafia roundup.
Whoa, hey.
But through his sources, he was able to find out that Bradley Funk had actually gone to the mafia in 1975 and asked for permission a year prior to Bowles' murder to have Don Bowles killed. And, you know, the mafia has a very strict policy. You don't kill cops. You don't kill journalists. However, they felt that there's also another pretty hard and fast rule when it comes to the other side, journalists and law enforcement. You don't go after mafia members' families. And so even though Bradley Funk wasn't technically a made guy, he was doing business with the Bonanno family, the Chicago outfit. And they felt by Bowles using Bradley Funk's ex-wife, however he was using her, whether it was just to get information or something more personal, they felt that Bowles had crossed that line, and they okayed the murder of a journalist, and to the extent they actually sent a hitman out here by the name of Tony Rossi, who apparently at this time was also being looked at for the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance.
Ooh. And
so Tony Rossi was looking for a new place to play. You know, he had to get away from the East Coast where there was a lot of heat on him. So he came out and relocated to Phoenix or Scottsdale. I cannot remember. But Bradley Funk was known for being a little thrifty, we'll call him. And once he found out that it was going to cost $50,000 to kill a reporter, he backed out. And, you know, once he backed out, all the rules and the okays the mafia had given for this particular hit were gone, because this was no longer an authorized mob hit. And so what we believe happened is a year later, Bradley Funk, there were definitely a couple mafia figures involved in the execution of the murder, but because it wasn't a mob sanctioned hit, you know, the mob did plenty to help cover their tracks after the murder, but this was really a personal vendetta. And it also helped to cover up a massive story that Don Bowles was working on at the same time.
Well, and again, the creation of the false narrative after this, we just alluded to a gentleman by the name of Max Dunlap, who was a wealthy sportsman. And talk to me about the link between Max and a gentleman by the name of Kemper Marley, who was also another wealthy liquor dealer down there in that area. The tie between Kemper Marley and Max Dunlap.
So Kemper Marley was big time. He was worth, in the mid-'70s, he was worth around $400 million. So, you know, we're talking about maybe a billionaire a couple times over in today's economy.
Yeah.
And he was a liquor magnate, liquor wholesaler, and he had taken on Max Dunlap. This was the kid that was the homecoming king in high school. You could not find anyone in Phoenix with a bad thing to say about Max Dunlap. Family man, had 7 kids. And when he was in high school, he met Kemper Marley, who was a good deal older than him. And Kemper became almost like a mentor to him. And Kemper helped him when he first went into his business as a contractor with loans and things of that nature, and almost like a father figure role. And so the two men were very close. The theory that's been put out there by the state, and they tried Max Dunlap twice for this murder, was that In February of 1976, Kemper Marley was named to the Arizona Racing Commission, and Don Bowles wrote an article or two that were somewhat critical of Kemper Marley's background and some controversies he'd been involved in during the course of his professional life. And Kemper Marley ended up having to resign from the Racing Commission because of these particular skeletons being exposed. And again, this takes place in February. So the state's theory is that Kemper Marley went to Max Dunlap and said, I need to get rid of this reporter. I need you to do it for me. So Kemper Marley wasn't a nice guy. For him to go to Max Dunlap, some nice family man, to execute a murder of a journalist just seems so far-fetched.
Yeah.
And again, they wait 4 months to kill a guy over an article he wrote in the paper. It does not make sense. But what occurs is right after the bombing, again, John Adamson, I don't know if he didn't realize that Don Bowles is a journalist and he's going to write the name down of the guy he's meeting at the hotel on before he goes over there. So Adamson is suspect number one immediately. A local attorney by the name of Neil Roberts sneaks John Adamson and his wife just hours after the bomb goes off, flies them on a private jet to Lake Havasu, where Adamson hides out for about 24 hours while these guys get their story together. Adamson returns to Phoenix, I believe Thursday. The bomb went off Wednesday morning. I think it was Thursday night. Adamson's back in town. And by Friday morning, the Adamson and Roberts and those guys are hanging out at their favorite bar, and they know they're being surveilled by the police, and they start loudly pointing fingers at Max Dunlap while they know they are being watched. And so Neil Roberts somehow gets blanket immunity for his role in any of this, for providing Phoenix police a theory. That's a theory, not actual information. He provides a theory that this may have been some sort of rangeland justice over a negative article written in the Arizona Republic. That's how the state's theory took shape. And after about 6 months, John Adamson decides he'd cooperate because he was looking at the death penalty. And he corroborates the theory that Max Dunlap hired him to kill Bowles over a negative article written in the newspaper. And he also throws a guy by the name of Jimmy Robeson into the mix. And so Max Dunlap and Jimmy Robeson are arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and convicted and sentenced to death, all based on a theory, basically.
And Jimmy Robeson is still in prison, even though his conviction was actually overturned.
So he actually, just to correct you,
I'm sorry.
That, he was no. He did remain in prison. So in 1980, the Arizona Supreme Court overturned both men's convictions. Dunlap was freed. Jimmy Robeson remained in prison for another 12 or 13 years, based for a separate crime. The information that placed him in this crime was given to Phoenix PD by, you guessed it, John Adamson. So Jimmy Robeson sat in prison from 1978 when he was convicted until 1990, 94, 95, after the second murder trial in which he was acquitted. But Jimmy Robeson spent almost 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And to know, I mean, that these guys were messing with like I said, talking the right stuff to the wrong people, but the body count did not just end with Mr. Bowles. He passed his work off to a gentleman by the name of Tom Sanford. That was his right-hand man, and basically was supposed to carry on his legacy with the work. Talk to me about Tom Sanford and what fate he befell.
I'm glad you brought that up. So Tom Sanford was an editor at the Arizona Republic, and he eventually became Don Bowles' personal editor. He, like Don Devereaux says, Bowles was always like one step away from a libel suit. So the newspaper had assigned Tom Sanford as kind of his personal guy. And Sanford was privy to everything Bowles was working on. When Bowles is murdered and the state's theory takes shape, Tom Sanford, knowing what they had been working on, did not buy this for a second. There, at the time, something I left out, shortly after Bowles' murder, a an organization called IRE, which is the Investigative Reporters and Editors around the country, all flocked to Phoenix, Arizona for what became coined the Arizona Project, where these journalists decided to show you can kill a journalist, but you can't kill a story. So they descended on Phoenix and spent a year continuing Don Bull's investigative work. Now, they did not investigate the murder. They made a decision that they were going to leave that alone so they weren't stepping all over Phoenix PD's investigation. Anyways, Tom Sanford went to his bosses at the Arizona Republic, said, I want to be part of the Arizona Project. They told him not only was he not allowed to be part of the Arizona Project, he was not even allowed to have contact with the journalists who had all come here to continue Bowles' work. So Sanford decides to to open up his own investigation into the Bowles murder. And about 5.5 months after the murder of Bowles, Tom Sanford comes home late one night. His daughter is, I believe it was over the holidays. His daughter was home from college for Christmas break, and her dad walks in looking white as a ghost, and she says, what's wrong? And he tells her, I've just gotten some information that could get all of us killed. And that's all he said to his daughter. The next morning, he decides he's had enough at the Arizona Republic, resigns, packs up his desk. Oh, but prior to going and packing his desk at the Arizona Republic, he makes an excited phone call to Rosalie Bowles, the widow of Don Bowles, and says, I got some information last night. I know what happened to Don. I know who killed him. We need to get together as soon as possible so I can go over the information I've just received. Rosalie Bowles had something going on that day with the children. She wasn't available, so they make plans to meet early the next morning at a park where neither of them will be recognized. Kathy Colby, the lady I brought up earlier, the confidant of Bowles, was sitting at the kitchen table with Rosalie Bowles and heard the entire conversation as Rosalie Bowles turned the phone so both of them could listen to what Tom Sanford's saying. So Sanford goes, packs up his desk at the Republic, leaves, goes out to lunch, a lively lunch from what we learned with a fellow Arizona Republic journalist by the name of Bill Meek. Showed no signs of any stress, depression, trauma, nothing. Had a lively conversation talking about what's next for him. He had a couple job offers already. Goes home, and 2 hours later, Tom Sanford's body is discovered out in the boondocks off the freeway with half of his head blown off and a shotgun between his legs. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Department, whoever, they put in the call as 666, which is a suicide. The crime scene investigator comes out there and finds some really interesting things. Number one, the shotgun that Tom Sanford allegedly used to kill himself had been wiped clean of fingerprints. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the front seat, yet that had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and the autopsy on Tom Sanford showed not one drop of alcohol.
No alcohol. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah,
that was interesting.
Not only that, but this was like a collector's item shotgun. He was awarded this for being by the Arizona Press Club for being Journalist of the Year. This shotgun was really long. Tom Sanford stood off like 5 feet 6, and they don't believe there's any way he could have pulled the trigger with the shotgun being placed on his head like it was. So there are all these suspicious things about this quote-unquote suicide, yet the case is quickly closed. The Arizona Republic the next day quickly births this narrative that Sanford was depressed over losing his job at the Republic, et cetera, et cetera. All the investigative work Tom Sanford had been doing disappeared from his home the day he died. All the investigative materials that Don Bowles had been giving Tom Sanford copies of disappeared on the day that he died and remains missing to this day, according to a legal affidavit provided by his wife, Janet.
Unbelievable.
So we believe this is a second murder of a journalist within 6 months, and it did not even make a ripple in the news.
Well, and the body count doesn't stop there, because I believe there was some litigation that went down. And again, one of their star witnesses for this land deal, this straight up gangster stuff that was going on in Arizona, reached potentially and allegedly as high as Barry Goldwater. Talk to me about who Ed Lazar was. He was an accountant for some of these companies. Talk to me about him, his role, and what happened to Ed.
Sure. Well, Ed worked for a guy by the name of Ned Warren, who was called the land fraud king of Arizona. Ned Warren was born Nathaniel Waxman back east. He had just gotten out of prison a few years prior to relocating out here. He was tied in with the New York mob, comes out here and starts this business as kind of a fraudulent land developer. And with the assistance of Barry Goldwater, who wrote letters of recommendation to all the GIs in Vietnam, starts selling fraudulent parcels of land to our military men while they're overseas fighting in the Vietnam War. This was a mafia-backed and financed operation. Ned Warren was eventually convicted and given 80 years of prison time. He died in prison. However, before he was indicted and tried, as they were investigating Ned Warren, a number of people in and around Ned Warren's universe start dropping dead, one of which, Ed Lazar, was hours away from testifying in front of a grand jury. And Ed Lazar, the morning of his grand jury appearance, is shot to death in a stairwell in downtown Phoenix. And again, I believe the final count was close to a dozen people that worked with or for Ned Warren who found themselves 6 feet under before they could ever testify against him. And, you know, the theory was that this was the Bonanno family cleaning up because Joseph Bonanno had a number of financial ties with Ned Warren, and a lot of his criminal financial interests were intertwined with Ned Warren out here in Arizona. So it was believed that a lot of the cleanup was done by the Bonanno crime family.
And again, man, this is all just scratching the surface, guys. I mean, this is some deep stuff, dude. Check out The Syndicate over there at Criminal Minded Media. You will not be disappointed without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's again, these stories are so like transferable, whether it's this. I mean, I used to sell T-shirts, IAOC. It's all organized crime. Whatever, we see it all the time, man. We see it all the time. And we're going to move on to this next one, man. Something I've been hugely passionate about. I mean, I'm an old school hip hop kid. It broke my heart what happened to the legendary Notorious B.I.G. as well as Tupac. I mean, especially happening under dubious circumstances. These guys were some of the biggest stars in the world, and yet there's been still, I mean, whatever, the bullshit going on in Vegas now with Keefe D. There hasn't been any arrests or any justice in this case. It seems like they're kind of inextricably linked to some degree, but let's talk about that big case. March 9th, 1997, Christopher Wallace is attending an after party at the Peterson Museum. Man, all kinds of things unfolded. Talk to me about your thoughts on that night. Obviously, the murder and the cover-up. Again, so many players involved, so many layers to this. Let's get started.
Sounds good. So, obviously, we all know at this point, Biggie Smalls was murdered on March 9th, 1997, as he left the Peterson Automotive Museum, I believe it was a Vibe post-awards party, and as this is a really, really, like we talked about the Bulls case having a lot of layers. I mean, the Biggie case has just as many layers, if not more. And it's all coming off. And you do kind of have to preface it with what had been going on between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Records and you know, Tupac. It's funny. Everybody always likes to think that this all started because of Tupac and Biggie's beef over Quad Studios. But that's not really, I mean, Tupac was like pouring lighter fluid on the flame when he got out of prison and joined Death Row. But there was a hatred. I mean, Suge Knight hated Puffy Combs. All you have to do is go back and watch the Source Awards in 1995 to see how he tried to humiliate him in front of a packed auditorium.
If I may say real quick, something that did not help after Tupac was shot, for Puffy to be a fucking moron and release Who Shot Ya, even though it had nothing to do with Tupac, that was like so incendiary. That did not help anything. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and you're right. And that had been recorded, I believe it was 2 years earlier.
Yeah, way before.
Like, you know, and if you're going to release it, you best get out in front of the cameras and say up and down, like, we love Tupac. This isn't about Tupac. Enjoy the song. But I agree with you. There was a lot of dumb shit that was done by both Suge and Puffy through the course of this whole thing. And so this beef is getting nastier and nastier. Then you have the whole incident in Atlanta where Suge's buddy / muscle, Jake Robles, is shot to death. immediately following a shouting match between Suge, Jake, Puffy, Wolf Jones. So there's just more and more acts of violence. There's a friend of Puffy's who's basically kidnapped at Death Row's Christmas party and tortured as they try to get Puffy's home address and Puffy's mother's home address. Obviously, we know what happens in Vegas. So for Puffy to come out here as laissez-faire as he did, that I always tell people I don't believe Suge had anything to do with Tupac's murder, but I believe Suge's arrogance played a role in his murder by their actions that night on September 7th. And I think the same thing can be said for Puffy.
Creating an environment.
Puffy had anything to do with Biggie, actually being murdered, but his arrogance after, he was warned multiple times the day of that the whispers were that people were coming to kill them that night, and he just blows it off.
And so that's what Big Gene says. That's his sentiment. It's like you didn't have to, but you created an environment. And you know what's crazy, and you know this, they had been out there for like a month. They had been out there for
Biggie had been out there for a month with Little C's and no security whatsoever. Right. These guys are cruising around, going to the movies, going to the park, shooting hoops, like just the two of them. If this was about killing Biggie, that's the part that I until I'm blue in the face, I try to explain to people. They had to wait because Puffy was priority one. Puffy's a very lucky man that he had Eugene Deal in that SUV with him that night. Otherwise, we would be waxing poetically about the short life of Sean Puffy Combs instead of Biggie.
And that's it can't be overestimated. You mentioned in the beginning FBI agent, that's Phil Carson, who pretty much tipped everybody to the game that night Puff was the original target. And as you said, as Eugene Deal, trained security, had just taken a class as far as just urban security or whatever it is, street security, and he told his driver, blow this first light. And so that person blew that first light and the second person didn't. And that's when the shooter, I don't know, as Gene says, he didn't pull up to shit because he had been sitting there all night. But I'm sorry, continue.
Correct. That's the interesting thing. There's so many interesting things.
Yeah.
But this Chevy Impala had been parked on the side of the street all night. Number one, how is that possible out back of an award show celebration where this car with no license plates, mind you, is parked there all night? Then you have, and I'm not going to be politically correct here. You have Amir Muhammad approach Eugene Deal. I'm not going to say a guy dressed as a Muslim. We know it was Amir Muhammad at this point. Amir Muhammad approaches Puffy's car first. What's interesting is I was just rereading some of the FBI documents and LAPD documents with regards to what Eugene Deal told investigators. And he says in his first interview with LAPD, which is sometime in 1997, it wasn't even part of LAPD's robbery homicide division yet, that when Amir approached him, there was a white handkerchief in his hand covering something up. And that's when Eugene Deal showed his weapon and Amir turned and walked in the direction of where that black Chevy Impala was parked. We know less than 5 minutes later, a guy dressed just like the guy that Big Gene Deal shooed away from Puffy's car pulls up next to Biggie and starts firing into the car. And the Amir connection is, and again, this is such a deep, dark rabbit hole.
Sure.
I hope I'm not throwing too many names at listeners, but it's found rather quickly. People like the Greg Kadings of the world and the Reggie Wrights of the world and people like that who like to
Greg
deny.
Kading, former LA. We don't want to assume everybody knows who is. Greg Kading, former LAPD. Reggie Wright, former head of Right Way Security that did security for Death Row.
Yeah, these guys who claim that there was no conspiracy and it was just some random drive-by by a gangbanger. It's pretty obviously highly coordinated. You're not going to be able to pull off a hit like this at an award show after party with some gangbanger just driving by and taking some shots into the car. This was a highly orchestrated hit. We find out interestingly, in the FBI files, within 24 hours of the murder, there's a confidential informant telling LAPD that a police officer named Mac was paid $25,000 and was involved in this hit. 4 or 5 days later, you have an anonymous caller call Miss Wallace and state that a guy by the name of D-Mac was responsible for her son's murder. Russell Poole, who was the original, so about a month into Biggie's murder,
Hey, hold on.
Wilshire
Let's
Division.
just, for the sake of just a little bit more comprehensive, as we go through these names, let's break it down. David Mack.
You got it.
As you said before, there's an association between David Mack and the alleged assassin, Amir Muhammad, going back to Oregon, the University of Oregon. So they've known each other forever. And Amir Muhammad was the first person to visit David Mack in prison after he got pinched for robbing a bank. We'll get into that stuff too. But David Mack was a part of kind of a crew back in the day. We're going to get into the Rampart stuff. So David Mack, former LAPD gangster dude doing gangster shit, and the car, the Impala that was supposedly in this crime, was supposedly tied to him. So that's who David Mack was. And Russell Poole, who you're about to bring up, was one of the first persons to start the investigation after, going back to what you mentioned earlier, Frank Liga shot Kevin Gaines, and Russell Poole, former LAPD robbery homicide detective, was the first one on that case. So that's who those guys are.
Yeah, my apologies.
No, that's all right.
Yeah,
no, I
Russell
know.
Poole, Russell Poole was assigned to the Kevin Gaines Frank Liga shooting, and early in that investigation, he starts to discover these ties between Kevin Gaines, off-duty LAPD officer that was shot and killed by undercover detective Frank Liga. Kevin Gaines is driving the SUV he's driving when he is shot to death is registered to Sharitha Knight, wife of Suge Knight, owner of Death Row Records. Kevin Gaines the evidence starts to pop up that Kevin Gaines is tied in with Death Row Records, and he is not the only LAPD officer involved with Death Row Records.
Yes.
There's a receipt found in Kevin Gaines's wallet for almost $1,000 from Monty's Steakhouse, which is a known Death Row hangout. And then about, I believe it's April 1st, according to LAPD documents. At this point, the murder took place in the jurisdiction of Wilshire Division. So the Wilshire Division detectives at this point had the Biggie murder case. They contact Russell Poole because he's working the Gaines-Liga case and tell Russell Poole, we have information that Kevin Gaines may have been involved in the Biggie murder or a person of interest in the Biggie murder. And they ask for information on Gaines and a six-pack with Gaines in it from Detective Poole. A week later,
and just you guys mentioned that a lot in Collateral Damage, the term six-pack, and I know what it is.
Yeah.
But what is a six-pack?
A six-pack is a photo lineup that witnesses are shown by law enforcement if they're trying to identify a suspect. So it'll just be 6 photos, no names, no nothing, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So Kevin Gaines would have been one of the photos in this six-pack that witnesses were being shown. So Wilshire Division requested a six-pack with Kevin Gaines from Detective Poole. And about a week later, I want to say it's April 8th or April 9th of 1997, Wilshire Division is just so overwhelmed with this Biggie murder case that it is transferred over to LAPD's robbery homicide and Russell Poole and his partner, Fred Miller. That's when they officially take over the case. But there were a number, people like to paint because it's just easier to pass something off if you try to label it as one person, a lone wolf with this crazy theory about police involvement in the case. Unfortunately, we have access to a lot of the LAPD documents that were prior to Russell Poole taking over this case. And the connection between potential police involvement in the murder, that had already been made prior to Russ Poole ever touching this case. So you're starting to see these pieces of evidence that there might be something nefarious going on with at least Kevin Gaines at this point. Now, David Mack doesn't really become a person of interest for months until the bank robbery you briefly mentioned happened. David Mack called in or put in some family illness days in November of 1997. And during those family illness days, David Mack robbed a Bank of America of almost $800,000 while he was an active LAPD officer. And it is a month later when he is arrested and they're searching his house that all this evidence starts to appear that potentially links David Mack to the murder of Biggie.
And that's where they find the Impala, And I find it
Correct.
so frustrating that Russell Poole comes in there and he finds the Impala, like, oh, this is the Impala. And he is not allowed to do the forensic evidence on the Impala. He is prohibited as a lead detective in robbery homicide. He's not allowed to do forensic evidence. And the rare gecko rounds that they found at the scene of the crime, or the shells anyway, they find at Mac's house, and he's not allowed to do any ballistic evidence on that. That's insane.
Correct. Not only that, but when the FBI opened up their investigation, the LAPD refused to provide the casings for them to run ballistics tests at Quantico. They basically refused to give the FBI any of this evidence so they could run their own tests on it. It's crazy to think about, unless, there's that great line in City of Lies: a case like this only goes unsolved if the police don't want to solve it. And for them to block the FBI from running ballistics tests on what was found inside David Mack's house is more than suspicious, to say the least.
Well, and then you get into Steve, I forget his name now. Wow, I'm slipping. But
Steve Katz, I know where you're going.
Steve Katz, who had these crucial documents in his desk, which was a part of the case kind of not just getting dismissed, but it didn't go anywhere. But in their own language, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read this. This is from the dossier, you guys' website. In their own LAPD internal affairs documents, January 2001, the LAPD instituted a formal internal affairs investigation bearing LAPD internal affairs number CF010190. In this document itself alleged that Mack and Perez conspired to murder and assisted in the murder of Mr. Wallace. Bingo, from their own mouths. So it's not even a puzzle. It's just, I don't know. They just hide it in plain sight.
Correct. They just took all this information and put it in what's called the risk management offices. That is a level deeper than internal affairs. The risk management division of LAPD is where controversies go to die. It's where information and documents can be hidden and manipulated by a very, very, very small group of LAPD officers. And you brought up Steve Katz. This just shows you the level of corruption. So Steve Katz was, at the time, the lead detective on the Biggie murder investigation. As we know, the Wallace family, after Russell Poole goes public about his belief that these officers were involved in the murder, Russell Poole files a lawsuit against the LAPD for obstructing his investigation into the murder of Biggie. Biggie's family, through some incredible reporting by Rolling Stone writer Randall Sullivan, gets wind of what's going on in LA and potential police involvement. They sue the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD for wrongful death. As this case is heading down the tracks and goes, actually, the civil trial begins, the Wallace estate's lawyers are contacted by someone by the name of Xavier Hermosillo. Xavier Hermosillo was he was a lot of things. He was a media personality. He was a journalist, but he also worked with the LAPD. He was one of sorry, this is kind of a long, drawn out story, but Xavier Hermosillo was one of the judges in what are called Board of Rights hearings. That's when LAPD officers get in trouble. They have the option to go before a board. It's like a trial inside the LAPD, and Xavier Hermosillo would be one of the three adjudicators sitting on this panel that would decide guilty, innocent, etc. So Xavier Hermosillo had seen a lot of evidence that pointed to police involvement in Biggie's murder while sitting on these Board of Rights hearings. And he contacts the Wallace family's attorneys and says, I read in the paper LAPD saying that this evidence doesn't exist. Well, I've personally seen this evidence and initialed this evidence during Board of Rights hearings. So Perry Sanders, who was the lead attorney, stands up in court and says, we've been given information that LAPD may be hiding evidence from us. Here's the information we have. A federal judge basically shuts down robbery homicide division. The U.S. Marshals go in. They find hundreds of pages of documents, LAPD documents, pointing to officers David Mack and Rafael Perez being involved with Biggie's murder that are hidden inside lead detective Katz's desk in a secret compartment that Katz has coined the Forgotten Files cabinet. And so there are literally hundreds of pages of evidence pointing to these two guys' involvement in the murder, where the lead investigator on the Biggie murder was hiding this evidence from the Wallace attorneys and just in general. I mean, it tells you they did not want to solve this case. They wanted to make sure this case was not solved.
Well, and not only does this look, it's a huge bad look on the LAPD, systematic corruption, even though they may have directly through their your Macs of the world and your Gaines of the world, et cetera, were a part of the murder and the cover up. You had mentioned the lawsuit, which was like almost $500 million to $1 billion based off of Biggie's future earnings. So
Correct.
Not only would you have had that, you had already had the background of the last few years of Rodney King, the riots, OJ, Kevin Gaines, who was killed, already had a lawsuit going on prior to his death, and then his family after his death added a wrongful death lawsuit. So you're talking about a lot of money. Talk to me about the potential if this went through, which lends itself to why they had to cover it up. What happens if the LAPD is found complicit in the way they would have been found complicit? What are the ramifications of that?
I'm really glad you asked me that, because that's something that people really need to understand when looking at this cover up. LAPD was a mess at this particular moment. You had, like you said, Rodney King, followed by OJ, followed by the Gaines-Liga, Biggie, then Gaines-Liga. Then you have David Mack rob a bank. Then you have Rafael Perez getting caught stealing 13 pounds of cocaine from LAPD's evidence lockers and selling it to the Bloods.
Yeah.
So this is all happening at the same time, to the extent that the United States Justice Department had placed the LAPD under what's called the consent decree. And what that is the Justice Department basically says, we no longer believe that you can police yourselves, so you are going to be placed under a federal monitor for a period of 5 years. So this is all happening in real time as the lawsuit hits the courts. If LAPD was found to be liable in this case, number one, it would have bankrupted the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD. There most likely would not be a Los Angeles Police Department anymore. Most likely, Los Angeles would be policed by the LA Sheriff's Department. That's the stakes that this lawsuit really had when it hit the courts. I mean, this would have been the end. And again, this is all happening while LAPD is under a federal monitor because of how corrupt they were. And the sad part is, like, the Rampart scandal was this nice little bow that they used to hide all the other crap that was going on. But we in our conversations with Frank Liga, some of the information he gave us that he was told by the Rampart Task Force, a perfect example, he was told by Brian Tyndall when he was called in to speak with the Rampart Task Force that this little gangster crew of cops were suspects in 60 home invasions, 30 bank robberies, and at least 3 murders. Yet none of that you ever hear about. They decided, let's let Mac go down for the bank robbery. Let's let Perez go down for the stolen cocaine. That's it. Nothing else happened on our watch.
So let's qualify for our newcomers. That Rampart division, the Rampart scandal in the 90s, chop it up, because that's what these guys were a part of. Rafael Perez, all these guys were a part of this Rampart scandal. What was that what was Rampart back in the day?
So Rampart was a police station in probably one of the tougher areas in LA to police. I mean, just overrun by gangs. And in, I want to say, the late 80s, the crash units were created, which stands for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. And these were almost like tactical units inside neighborhoods that targeted gangs, and they like a really hard, aggressive style of policing. Now, what it morphed into, unfortunately, where they became the biggest gang on the block. They were ripping off drug dealers. They were planting evidence. They were, there's one of the, probably the biggest case that came out of Rampart was Rafael Perez and his former partner, a guy by the name of Nino Durden, shot an innocent kid accidentally. And instead of doing the right thing, calling an ambulance, whatever, they decide to plant a throwdown gun next to him, fire off a couple shots with that gun, and then claim that this kid attempted to murder the two of them. So this kid, Javier Ovando, not only was he paralyzed from the chest down, but he was given 25 years in prison for attempted murder of a police officer.
Shut
and
up.
it was 3 or 4 years after he had been imprisoned that Perez admitted what they had done. Ovando was immediately released from prison, obviously sued the city of Los Angeles. I believe Javier Ovando was awarded $15 million in the lawsuit, but
oh my
$15 million doesn't give you your legs back, And so that's
but this all
thing.
of this, man, God, people, listen, this is the environment, dude, the absolute cauldron of just corruption, next level.
Yes.
I mean, and clearly on the list was contract killing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, and I debate this with a couple of my cohorts over here, but when David Mack's house was raided and search warrants were served and everything else after his arrest for the bank robbery, one of the things they found underneath in a secret compartment underneath his closet was a case with a machine pistol with 3 silencers. Now, tell me, what on earth does anybody need a silence for unless your job is quietly killing people?
Yes.
There's a reason it is a felony to own a silencer.
Yeah, unless you're on some James Bond.
Contract killing was part of their off-duty job description.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, as I alluded to in the beginning, you don't need all of this huge, vast myriad of people to maintain a conspiracy, especially in this case. And like I said, this kind of architecture, ripple effects, and all these different conspiracies, all you needed in L.A. was a Chief Bernard Parks to maintain the narrative, to create the narrative and keep the lid on shit. And then you had Chuck Phillips at the LA Times to just maintain the narrative. That's all you really, and then, U.S. attorneys or whatever refused to press shit. But that's, like you said earlier, like we're just such slaves to it. Well, if Bernard Parks said this, he would never lie. And Chuck Phillips, he's an esteemed journalist. He would never lie. And that's essentially what we have when we see kind of propaganda in a myriad of forms, this maintaining these false narratives. So, I definitely, man, criminal-minded media, check out the dossier. But before I let you slide, because this is something you said to me a while ago and you alluded to I also want to talk to you about this. Collateral damage is something that is about, as you like to say, the tangentially affected people in this world of death row. That's kind of what you guys deal with when you start in this show, collateral damage.
Correct.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that, because it is interesting, because we think about Big, we think about Pac, we think about these big players involved, but there's so many layers and nooks and crannies of names we've probably never heard of that still lend itself to the absolute toxicity of this world that everyone was living in at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So to back up a little bit, myself and a brilliant young lady by the name of Nicole Luciano have, for the most part, since, we began this journey about 4 years ago, worked in the background, whether it's research, trying to track down documents, sources, etc. And I think I'm pretty good at this, but Nikki is a savant when it comes to this stuff. I mean, that girl has got like the tracking skills of a bloodhound. She's amazing. And that's why she's starting to work on so many of these true crime TV shows that we talk about on Oxygen and things like that. But, Nikki and I have started looking at some of the peripheral stuff. There was a source of ours that told us a couple years ago that there were up to 20 unsolved murders that were tangentially tied to death row records, the Bloods, Bad Boy, all this stuff. And so the two of us thought, as much as we love to talk about the Biggie case and the Tupac case, there was so much, use the term again, but there was so much collateral damage around those two murders and this beef. And you can go down the list. It's incredible. Like we talked about the Jake Robles killing in Atlanta, it really is fascinating. And it really is. It's heartbreaking to see all these families who are missing loved ones today because their brother, son, husband, whoever just happened to have a little minor tie to this world. And so we have started digging into that. And Nikki and I are lucky enough to have sources and people like RJ Bond who can come on and really help us dissect some of this stuff. But we've just been fascinated by all of it. And we thought, you know what? It's time to start digging into all this while we're on hiatus. So Nikki and I will continue to be there giving everybody content when it comes to some of the the killings in Compton and New York, just all of the peripheral stuff that went on around these two infamous murders.
Well, and now you guys are definitely going to be kept busy because obviously, whether you choose to get into it or not, the Keefe D thing, cover that because that is, the first arrest in the Tupac murder. And then obviously you have Homeland Security raiding Sean Puffy Combs, how much meat's going to be pulled off that bone. I mean, that's absolutely insane. Again, before I let you go, a big shout out to Nikki too. I listened to you guys on Collateral Damage. I'd love to have a beer with that girl. I like Nikki, dude. She is a go-getter, man. She's definitely a go-getter. I love her energy, man. She takes no shorts and she gives no fucks. Like she's doing her thing, man. She's doing her thing.
Nikki is the best. I cannot tell you how much I enjoy chopping this stuff up with her. Like I said, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it'll be 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, and I'll get a text from her, and we'll be up till 1 a.m. talking about the information she just got, or she'll play me a recording of somebody she just spoke to. I mean, she lives, eats, breathes, sleeps this stuff just like me, and she is just so good at what she does, man. She really pushes me to do a better job because I just need to keep up with her. But she is, I've enjoyed working with her for years, and now I'm really enjoying co-hosting a show with her because she is brilliant and a go-getter. She's a blast to work with.
Iron sharpens iron, man. You always got to surround yourself with like-minded people who are getting after it like that. So something you guys touched on, and you told me this months ago, and it really blew my mind. It's something you guys touched on in one of your last episodes of Collateral Damage, yes. Mickey Thompson, as we talk about the world of Rampart and the potential of contract killings, bank robberies, and all the gangster shit they were into, you have alluded to it. Potentially, they are responsible, or a couple of cats in that world are responsible for the death of one of the most iconic people in racing parts history, Mickey Thompson and his wife in broad daylight. Talk to me, brother.
That case, so I actually stumbled upon it accidentally. I was going back to I was rereading Labyrinth. I do this sometimes. I have OCD when it comes to these cases, and I'll say, you know what, I need to give it another read. What did I miss? What did I miss? And so in reading that, I came across an excerpt where Randall Sullivan was talking about this case, in part because shortly after, let me set it up a little bit. So Mickey Thompson and his wife are embroiled in a pretty ugly business dispute with a guy by the name of Mike Goodwin, a former concert and rock music promoter who had gotten into promoting racing and things like that, had gone into business with Mickey Thompson and his wife, and the business relationship soured pretty badly. And one morning, Mickey Thompson and his wife, Trudy, are leaving their home. It's between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning. And as they go to get in their cars, these two young, athletic, African-American gentlemen ride up on 10 speeds, jump off their bikes, pull guns, and execute Mickey Thompson and his wife in their driveway. They first make Mickey Thompson watch as they execute his wife in front of him, and then they execute Mickey Thompson, and they jump on their 10-speed bikes, and they're gone like the wind. Now, I know everybody listening is probably saying that's a stretch, John. It is. I acknowledge that. But what's interesting is a couple things. Number one, when you take a look, there was a family next door. I don't want to give their names, but there was a family next door. The daughter, who was 12 or 13 years old at the time, and her father witnessed the entire assassination, just stood there in shock in this upscale neighborhood just outside of Beverly Hills, watching this older couple be executed in the driveway next door. And this father and daughter assisted the LAPD in creating composite sketches and, height, weight, age, etc. Of the suspects. And when you look at these composite sketches, the one looks identical to David Mack. The other one looks a heck of a lot like Amir Muhammad. The heights, weights, ages at the time, identical to Mack and Muhammad at that time. And now, it still is a bit of a stretch, right? But when David Mack is arrested for the bank robbery and is sitting in the Montebello City Jail, the first person to contact him with a note stating anything you need is Mike Goodwin, who since this time has been convicted of plotting the murder of Mickey Thompson and his wife. He sits in prison right now on a life sentence. However, the two shooters have never been identified. But the fact that the man who was convicted of killing Mickey Thompson and his wife reached out to David Mack immediately following his arrest and in a somewhat desperate sounding note saying, anything you need. I know this, and this is what kind of drew me to it. According to Randall Sullivan in Labyrinth, Russell Poole, while understanding this is a long shot, wanted to look into this case and the possible connections. However, Bernard Parks and his cronies would not let them within a mile of this case because, as we know at that point, all they wanted to do was bury David Mack under the bank robbery. And just another real quick example of that, David Mack, while he's awaiting trial on the bank robbery, hires somebody to murder his girlfriend, who's the one that assisted him. She was the bank manager who ordered all the money for the bank robbery. She is decided to cooperate against her boyfriend, David Mack. So Mack hires somebody to kill Erilyn Romero, his girlfriend. The hitman he hires gets cold feet and confesses this to his lawyer, who then takes him to LAPD, where he confesses he was hired by David Mack to kill Erilyn Romero. Yet David Mack was never charged for this. Why? You have the hitman confessing he was hired by David Mack to kill this woman, but there's never been any charge of attempted murder of a government witness or anything. And it once again just shows they had no interest in getting David Mack for any murders, Biggie or otherwise. They just wanted him to go away with the bank robbery.
Yeah.
And that's
which he never said anything about. Did his time. He did his time, and they never found that money. But no, yeah, you're right, because essentially they were operating freaking Murder Inc., dude. And when you start talking about contract killing again, check it out, man. It's weird to me because Amir Muhammad's handprints and everything is all over this, though he's never really been, from my understanding, talked about, given any legitimacy that he had any role in this, which we know he did. But a little bit of background on him. Not too long after that, Amir Muhammad's ex-girlfriend, and her boyfriend were accosted by Amir. I forget how it played out, but threatened to kill him, et cetera, something. And then 4 or 5 days later, after Amir accosts them and threatens them, these two people are found dead, and it's apparently a murder-suicide. Talk to me about your thoughts on that.
Yes, so I'm glad you brought that up. Amir, it's funny, the people who like to paint Amir as this poor, innocent mortgage broker who's had his life ruined by this wrongful accusation. Amir Muhammad was arrested 4 times for domestic abuse with regards to the same woman. Her name was Angelique Mitchell. The 4th time he was arrested, Angelique Mitchell was leaving work one day with her new boyfriend. And as they're driving on the freeway, she looks in the rearview mirror and notices that Amir Muhammad is following her. Amir Muhammad then pulls up next to them, opens his passenger window, and points a Beretta gun at her and her new boyfriend. She immediately pulls off the freeway, calls the police. Amir Muhammad is pulled over where, lo and behold, they find a Beretta, just like the one described on the 911 call. Amir says, "Oh, I forgot all about it." He's cited, arrested, and released. And 6 days after this case never went to trial because 6 days later, Amir's ex-girlfriend, Angelique, and her new boyfriend are both shot to death in an alleged murder-suicide where the only witness is some random unnamed LAPD officer who claims that the two of them burst out onto their front yard and her boyfriend shot her, then shot himself in plain view of an LAPD officer. Sure. Sure, that's the way it happened. Something else about our poor little innocent mortgage broker, Amir, he was also arrested and charged by the Department of because the Department of Motor Vehicles discovered that he had falsely acquired 4 different California IDs and driver's licenses with 4 different names. So I'm sure all mortgage brokers need to have multiple identities.
Jesus. It's not funny. Either you laugh or you cry because honestly, it is deeply frustrating to see these kind of transgressions, take place in front of our eyes, and it seems so obvious as far as tracking down who did it. But like you said, these things don't go unsolved unless they want it to go unsolved. And that's when you get the background specifically on the Biggie stuff and the potential financial hit, as well as the social hit and LAPD being almost dissolved. A lot of dirt was going on, man. And IAOC, it's all organized crime, man. Everywhere you go, not everywhere you go, but it's in all of these cases, man. If you want to see and hear more of this, criminalmindedmedia.com. They're crushing it over there. You're crushing it. And I can't thank you enough for your time, John. I really can't, man.
Oh, man, it's been a blast. I'm glad we finally did this.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you're always welcome back, because I know you guys got the dossier part 3 I think coming up, and then you guys are killing it more with collateral.
We got all kinds of stuff. We're cooking all kinds of stuff in the kitchen for you, for all of our listeners.
Man,
sure.
Again, shout out a little social media. Where can we track you down and see what you guys are up to?
So our website is criminalmindedmedia.com. You can follow the dossier on our Instagram page, the Dossier Podcast. We have a YouTube channel, Criminal Minded Media, as well, where we're starting to upload a lot of our podcasts. And recently, we have created a Patreon page called Dossier World. And on this Patreon page, for subscribers, I'm the one that actually runs it. So every other day, I'm dropping, whether it's documents, exclusive audio, exclusive video, like the video deposition of Mario Hammonds, in which he claims Suge Knight confessed his role and the police's role to this murder. We're dropping stuff basically every day on Dossier World's Patreon page that you can't get anywhere else. I mean, from literally documents that are currently under federal seal. You can take a look at them on our Dossier World page. So check us out on Instagram, on Patreon, our website, and obviously anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find our catalog, the Criminal Minded Media catalog.
You will not be disappointed. John Anagnapoulos, the Greek, I thank you so much, man. Continued
Thanks,
success
Jeff.
to you.
I had a great time.
Thank you. Take care, you guys. Peace and so much love. Stay tuned. You know what it is. There'll always be more.